was an interesting conference, but the young people really had tools of fire and something good with that.
Oh yes, we have some relationship with them. That's very nice. But
William.
Yeah.
Well,
I've been there.
yeah, I guess we have thought about how to make more of the campus, create spaces where people can interact and for research and find out more about the environment. And we talk with the council about trying to link up with the farms and
We will start shortly.
Cultural hub.
For Zoom audience, we will start shortly as well.
Genetic work that goes on there, and there's still people in environmental services, original planting, boosting yield. But that was what it was asked to do after the war. Go through.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, we are starting session 2. Where is Trevor? Is Trevor coming? Trevor will be the introducer for both speakers who are sitting down here. So we're just waiting for Trevor to come. Trevor, the floor is yours.
Okay.
It's all working. Yeah, if you understand there, I think the Zoom people can see your face, so everything is ready.
And when we come to James, you come and swap over the presentations. Is it already stored?
Yeah.
So we're ready to go?
Yep.
Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope everyone has managed to find their way back, including the people who are watching us on Zoom. My name's Trevor Evans. I used to be chair of this branch, and I'm chairing this session this afternoon. And we're going to, the theme of our session is climate action for the United Kingdom. So this is the things that maybe we can change, either in what we do ourselves personally or what we try to persuade our government to do, which is perhaps what UNA is here for, to bring pressure to bear on the UK government to respond to the problems of climate change. So we've got 2 speakers this afternoon. We've got John McLaverty, who's a youth campaigner with Oxfam, and we've got James Clarke, who is head of communications at Rothamsted Research, which is our local agricultural research establishment in Harpenden, who are doing a lot of work on sustainable agriculture. So you may think, what has Oxfam got to do with climate change? But maybe that will connect very much with what we were listening to this morning, as to what can developing countries do. And no doubt we shall hear some answers to that question shortly. So John has worked with schools and young people. He holds an MSc in Development Studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. And prior to joining Oxfam, he was a middle leader in a London secondary school. So he's obviously well connected with the young people of this country. The world's poorest countries are disproportionately affected by climate change, but much of the appeal for funding for emergency humanitarian response has gone unmet. So John will talk about creating a new finance facility in accordance with the principles of climate justice. So without further ado, please welcome John McLaverty. Thank you.
Josh, thank you very much, Trevor. I feel like a bit of an imposter this afternoon. I'm not a policy person, or I'm not a COP negotiator. I'm a youth campaigner, but I do work on Oxfam's sort of climate campaign. And this afternoon, I'm going to just give you a little bit of a flavour of what Oxfam is thinking about around the climate crisis right now, and where the campaign is headed, and some of the questions we're going to be asking at COP27 in Egypt later this year. So, you know, the world, as we heard this morning, has... Oh, I'm too tired. So the world, as we heard this morning, has entered a new and dangerous era of climate change impacts. And these impacts are causing huge loss and damage, and are driving up inequality in the world's poorest countries and communities. And these are the places which have contributed the least to the climate crisis. As you can see in the photo, it's of the aftermath of Cyclone Kenneth hitting Mozambique in 2019. However, the funding for emergency humanitarian responses, like the one in the photo, and broader support to address loss and damage, such as rebuilding homes and vital infrastructure, is piecemeal and painfully inadequate. So Oxfam is arguing, and will continue to argue, that a new formula for footing the bill for climate loss and damage needs to be urgently found. Now, I always love looking at how Oxfam appeared in history. So I'm going to go back to the past, 1966. I was just about alive, I think. And this is an Oxfam newspaper appeal for a severe hunger crisis in India. And you know, the imagery and language in it looks very old-fashioned, even colonial. But you know, up until quite recently, when imagery caught up with the times, the messaging behind NGO humanitarian appeals has remained broadly the same. So the sort of standard presentation was that, or has been, that extreme weather-related humanitarian emergencies were one-offs, and they were responded to by the public and donors in a piecemeal way, one at a time. There was no underlying narrative, there was no cause or effect, and there was no explanation linking these emergencies together. And contributions from the public and institutional donors were, and I think still are, ad hoc and not linked to any sense of responsibility for causing the crisis in the first place. Now, if we wind forward to this year, to 2022, and these are a couple of tweets. Of course, there was no such thing as Twitter back in 1966, but the story of severe hunger crisis in the world still continues. Right now, there is an extremely severe crisis in East Africa, and with everything else going on in the world and our own country, it's virtually been unnoticed by very many people. And one thing which is changing is there is now also an underlying narrative which is explaining the crisis. So the tweet on the bottom of the screen actually is talking more explicitly now about climate justice and linking together the cause of the climate crisis, the fact that America and China together make 45% of global emissions, with the injustice that the parts of the world which are suffering the most make absolutely minuscule emissions in comparison. So it's talking about who is responsible and who should fit the bill. And I think it'd be interesting to trace how this shift in presentation and explanation began. I'd certainly say that the recent series of IPCC reports where the language of cause and effect has become a lot more unequivocal and a lot clearer is a really important factor. A few years ago, the sort of narrative was that extreme weather events could be caused by the climate crisis, or there is a link between them. Now there is a very clear language in those reports linking one to the other. So the question I think I'd like us to ask ourselves is, are we in a permanent and omnipresent runaway humanitarian crisis? And it just seems that as we go into the 21st century, year after year, recent events are showing that severe climate impacts are being felt almost everywhere in loss of life, loss of land, culture, homes and livelihoods, damage and disruption to agricultural systems, an increase in displacement and food insecurity. And these climate impacts are increasing inequality because people in poverty are the worst hit, and they find it much harder to recover than wealthier people. And that occurs in all countries, including to some extent here in the UK as well. So the photos show on the top left-hand side, the impact of Supertyphoon Rai in the Philippines in 2021, just the complete destruction of infrastructure, business and livelihoods. Secondly, how the impact of the climate crisis falls disproportionately on women. We heard about that as well this morning. When Cyclone Saroja hit Timor-Leste last year, women's needs were not mainstreamed into the disaster response in issues such as clothing, sanitary care, health, and so on. Flooding in Uganda, when there's been extreme rainfall, is the response has been inadequate, and the finances come in very slowly to rebuild infrastructure and buildings. And then finally, the last picture shows Somalia, and we are starting to identify long-term hotspots, which feature year after year in multiple humanitarian appeals. And these are locations where droughts can last for years on end, and where there are complex emergencies involving conflict and population displacement. And we'll look at those again in a moment. So right now in East Africa, 21 million people face starvation because of long-term drought. And if you just even think back the last month or two, we saw in South Africa the devastating floods in KwaZulu-Natal, which just about made our media, but they were followed straight away by very similar flooding with similar loss of life and damage in Brazil, in Pernambuco and Alagoas states. And this is just rotating and carrying on week after week, month after month. Most emergencies we don't even hear of in our news. So the humanitarian system is seriously overstretched, and adding the additional and increasing climate impacts to it make it almost untenable. So Oxfam estimates that the UN humanitarian system only covered about 7.5% of weather-related disasters in lower and middle-income countries in the last 20 years. So there's a new sort of language which I think we need to learn, and it's the language of loss and damage And it was interesting this morning, we heard the words mitigation and adaptation from our speakers many times. I think I heard loss and damage once, maybe twice. So loss and damage means the impacts of climate change that cannot or have not been adapted to. So there are events that have already happened. It can be the loss of life, livelihood, homes, and so forth. It can be damage to infrastructure, crop yields, and it can be economic or non-economic. So it includes culture, knowledge, biodiversity, indigenous lifestyles, and so on. So if we think of the three terms now, mitigation is averting or stopping carbon emissions in the first place, the net zero by 2050 drive. Adaptation is minimizing or reducing the impacts of climate change before they hit, building a green city, for example. And then loss and damage is addressing the impacts of climate change after they happen. And this is now recognized as a concept, but there is very little dedicated finance or architecture for that finance to be distributed. So I'm going to sort of divert now into a personal story. My wife, Carol Ann, is of Grenadian heritage. Grenada is a Caribbean island. The three-island state of Grenada, Carriacou, and Petite Martinique lies at the very southern tip of the Windward Islands, quite close to Venezuela and South America. Carol Ann went to school in Grenada. We have very close family ties and family links. If it wasn't for the pandemic, we would be visiting a couple of times a year. And we sort of have invested a lot of time and sort of family emotion and family connection in the country. And Grenada is suffering multiple climate impacts, rising sea levels. There's a change in the growing season of agriculture, which is disrupting farming. But I'm going to talk about Hurricane Ivan, which struck Grenada on the 7th of September 2004. And in a mere 8 hours, in which the eye of the storm moved over the island, twice the value of the country's GDP was destroyed in 8 hours. 90% of buildings were either destroyed or damaged by the storm, and 60,000 people, that's 60% of the population, were left homeless in that they did not have a roof over their heads. There were only 34 fatalities, primarily because with a hurricane you do get some warning and you can protect yourself. My elderly mother-in-law, who's disabled, hid under the stairs because that was the safest place in the house to protect herself. And then straight after the storm passed, there was a breakdown in social order. There was looting of shops and supermarkets and businesses, which took some time to restore. So all the photos were taken in Grenada. I visited just about 2 months afterwards. We went down to help rebuild the house. And the photographs are all from just after the hurricane. So as I'm looking, top left is the remains of the National Stadium, where that was a large cantilevered grandstand and was just completely smashed down to the earth. You imagine something like Wembley and it all just comes crashing down. It has been rebuilt. The Chinese government paid for it. And the West Indies recently defeated England there this summer, but that was what remained after Ivan. The next photograph shows the central market area. Many of the vendors, merchants, and small farmers who work in the market are women, and their livelihoods were just taken away overnight by Hurricane Ivan, and it took some time to rebuild. And then bottom right-hand side, that is the central fire station, which lost its roof and most of what was inside. Ivan destroyed Grenada's emergency response and administrative capacity. And
interrupting the screen, I think. The music coming from somewhere.
It's where's that from? Sorry about this. Is it next door? Is it outside?
That's not where it's coming from.
Is it,
No, it is. I'm not sure where it's coming from.
That's only button, isn't it? The power button.
Coming through the speakers or just outside?
I think no one's having a fun.
it sounds as if it's outside.
It could be outside.
Do you think it's outside?
Could be outside.
Somebody's having a better time than we are.
Probably the front next door.
I think they're trying to put this thing on. It's coming.
Are we okay?
I don't think it's coming through.
No, I don't.
No. But now I can't see. I see the screen.
You have the screen sharing.
Yeah. This is not showing. Is this yours?
That's part of it. That's going to be the next slide. These are.
Can't see the.
If this had happened in a school, I would have absolutely lost the room by now.
No, can't see the screen. Peter's here? Peter? Controls are at the very back. Still got all the people online.
Not very many.
That one's working, is it?
Yeah, that one's working. So where was your presentation?
We managed to lose the other two.
Yeah,
So was this your presentation?
that's my presentation.
Okay, so we just get that back. Why is it blank? Were you there or
The previous one.
sort of frozen? That's right.
This is probably thing. There we go. No. So let's go back a couple, and then we can.
So only one of this working. I think these TVs are just turned out. Gone off after some 30 minutes.
There's a red light on the
remote. Try to remote to a button. There's a TV with to go on.
Yes. It is, so I wonder if there's a similar.
Probably not used to this length of time.
Here it comes.
Make sure the Zoom is seeing you.
Okay. I'll try to remember where I left off and carry on. So I was, yeah. So I was, yeah. So the photograph shows the fire station with the roof off, and the emergency response. Grenada's ability to respond to its emergency was also massively reduced as well. And in fact, the government was evacuated onto a British warship because that was considered the best place for them to carry on from. And then the final photograph of the city centre of St. George's, you can see on the skyline the Catholic Cathedral with its roof removed, and behind it, the pink building is St. Joseph's Secondary Convent School, where my wife is an alumni, and it was also very seriously damaged, as were most of the schools and health facilities in the country. My mother and father-in-law's house, which is in a village about 3 or 4 miles away from the city centre, the roof came off pretty early in the storm. Water penetrated inside. We had just a couple of months before shipped on a whole load of nice IKEA kitchen furniture. If you want to see what IKEA furniture looks like after it's been hit by a hurricane, it's like a sort of paper mache bloop. It just turns into this horrible brown mush. There was no water for weeks. There was no electricity or no phone for months. The access road from the main road to the village was swept away. It's still not surfaced right now in this year. And, you know, putting all this right, fixing the loss and damage for every member of this community, for every citizen of Grenada, it was a family responsibility. So our family paid for it. The family members in the UK, the US, and Canada paid through remittances. Many insurance policies didn't pay out, or they paid out too little, or people weren't insured, or they couldn't get insurance. And some NGOs turned up and helped with things like roof repairs, but it was a chaotic situation. Oxfam arrived in Grenada and did provide water and sanitation in some of the more remote and hard to reach communities. Since then, the government, they said straight afterwards, we're in crisis, but we'll build back better. So they proceeded to build back better. And they did invest in replacing infrastructure, repairing roads, education and health. They sort of saw the crisis as an opportunity, I guess. But private investment got skewed even further towards luxury tourism and the cruise liner port. Like, please visit Grenada on a cruise if you get the chance ever, because it is very beautiful. And I would say that there hasn't been similar investment in building back in agriculture and basic rural services, where there's still very many underserved communities. 20 years later, the place looks rebuilt. A new Parliament building just opened before the pandemic struck, but there's still no proper courthouse. The National Court takes place in a sort of converted office building, which many people, lawyers, complain about. And Grenada is massively in debt. So the government has borrowed to rebuild, and debt is now 71% of GDP, which is very high for a sort of middle-income country. And development has been distorted. And right now, you know, Grenada is not as resilient as other countries to future shocks, because it has had such a shock which has taken 20 years to recover from. When COVID-19 struck, the entire country only had 5 ICU beds for COVID patients, and this led to pretty draconian curfews to try to impose social distancing upon the population. And of course, another hurricane could happen at any time. In fact, because of the climate crisis, another hurricane is more likely than it was back in 2004. And we've seen like the impact of, say, Hurricane Maria in Dominica and other tropical storms in the region recently. So this is one tiny little country of 100,000 people, and I hope you don't mind me just sort of focusing and talking about it, because I was there just afterwards and as a sort of family member saw what the impacts were. But if we zoom out over the world, the costs of climate impacts are huge, and they're continuing to skyrocket with every fraction of degree of global warming. And there's been a clear increase in economic losses from extreme weather-related disasters, as this graph from Aon shows. And according to Aon, in 2021, it was the first year that the top 4 disasters for economic damage were extreme weather-related. And each... Sorry? Okay, apologies. So according to Aon, 2021 was the first year that the top 4 disasters for economic damage were extreme weather related, and each one topped the $20 billion economic loss threshold. And the total economic cost of extreme weather related events in 2021 was estimated at $329 billion, the third highest on record. And you can see in the graph this sort of pretty steady increase from the 1950s up until the 2020s. In the future, estimates are staggering, ranging from $200 billion to over $2.5 trillion, depending which report you read. And there is currently no dedicated finance for this type of loss and damage. In fact, when Oxfam sort of tracked the responses to United Nations humanitarian appeals going from the year 2000 up until now, the graph shows the shortfall in the humanitarian appeals for extreme weather-related appeals. And the shortfall is increasing steadily over the last 20 years. The graph shows a sort of a high, medium, and low calculation, but whichever way you look at it, it's increasing greatly. And in fact, for every $2 required to deal with an emergency response following an extreme weather event, donor countries are only giving around about $1. And within this crisis, a number of countries are becoming hotspots. They have featured in extreme weather-related UN appeals 10 or more times since 2000. And these countries are Kenya, Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe, Burundi, Niger, Uganda, South Sudan, Chad, the DRC, Afghanistan, Haiti, Sudan, and Somalia. And these countries also, many of them have complex emergencies involving conflict and population displacement. So the humanitarian aid architecture is just not fit for purpose for meeting the climate crisis. And this is because north-south flows of finance to address loss and damage, they're provided within a sort of a normative framework of aid, mainly in the form of development of humanitarian finance and insurance. This is based on older principles of charity and enlightened self-interest, sometimes even overt geopolitics, and aid provision by donor countries, the wealthy countries, is mostly ad hoc and voluntary. So there's no connection between the provision of aid and responsibility for the harm that is being caused, because aid, the very principle of aid, is that it's from an altruistic third-party state who's not involved in the crisis. It's given by an external country to that emergency. But this is no longer fit for purpose in the climate crisis, where the polluting states who are emitting carbon are directly involved, and they are continuing to contribute to the harm suffered by states who need financial support to address loss and damage. So finance to address loss and damage should be provided not as a matter of charity or self-interest, but as a matter of justice, on the basis of responsibility held by the wealthiest and highest emitting countries, corporations or individuals. And how Oxfam outlines this, how to foot this bill is described in our paper, which I'd encourage you all to go online and have a look at. So as we come towards COP27 in Egypt to conclude, Oxfam is campaigning hard to have loss and damage placed far higher on the COP agenda than it was at Glasgow. It was barely recognised at COP26. The words loss and damage were sort of adopted, but any sort of amount of money or architecture to distribute it has yet to be agreed. Civil society, both in the global north and more importantly in the global south, is rallying behind the call for loss and damage finance. I'm involved with youth movements, both in the UK and also internationally, and young people are really making their voices heard. But you know, if we look last year, there were very few countries taking a progressive stand. Today, there's maybe only 4 or 5 countries who are leading the way, and one important player was the Scottish government, who at COP26 opened a loss and damage fund that they put £2 million into. That's a tiny, tiny, tiny drop in the ocean, but in terms of its symbolic importance and what it stood for as a progressive gesture, it was vitally important. So I'd say that as we sort of head towards COP27, countries are now feeling more pressure on loss and damage, even if they're still speaking rather than acting, which brings me back to campaigning and taking action, which I know you all have a great reputation for doing. So please do take a look at the Oxfam paper, and please join our, add your voices to our voices for loss and damage to be recognised at COP27 with much sort of greater determination and strength. So thank you very much.
We just need to swap over the presentations, so if you just bear with us for a few minutes.
Sorry for the music, there's a pub next door with music blaring.
That's the.
Good. Yeah. So we're ready to go? Yeah. Hopefully. Right. Ready to carry on with our next speaker, who is James Clarke, who's Head of Communications and Public Engagement at Rothamsted Research. After a life science degree, James spent a decade as a science journalist, followed by communications work for research institutes covering agricultural and environment research in Africa and Asia. He joined Rothamsted in 2018. He's going to talk about net zero by 2040. Can UK agriculture do it? UK farmers have been asked to reach net zero within 20 years. So what role is Rothamsted playing to help agriculture deliver a more sustainable future? From genetics to biocontrol, how can cutting-edge scientific studies help our farmers deliver? And if I'm be so bold, maybe that might apply to farmers elsewhere in the world as well.
Yes, it does. Yes,
So,
absolutely.
please welcome James Clarke.
Right. I'm told there's a couple of ex-Rothamsted people in the audience, so no heckling, please. And it's been enough dealing with Beyonce on the speakers. So yes, 2040, net zero by 2040, that is the NFU's ambition for UK agriculture. Obviously, it's a tough ask. Are we not moving on? There we go. Why is Rothamsted still around? Well, the reason we're still around after 179 years is that we have this particular problem, which is that we still need to produce an awful lot of food in the world. In fact, with changing diets and increasing populations, it's estimated that the amount of food that we're going to have to produce in the next 50 years is as much as we have ever produced in the entire history of humanity. That's a whole heck of a lot. And obviously trying to do that is a big challenge because we've got to do it without destroying the planet. And that's really Rothamsted's biggest challenge at the moment, is we've still got to produce food, but we've got to do it in an environmentally friendly way. And that challenge is enormous. Now, I've grouped the challenges that we work on into 5 groups here. Diets, a lot of our diets nutritionally poor, obviously in the West. It's a question of obesity, between 25 and 30% of adults in the UK obese. In other parts of the world, malnutrition, not having access to food, but also not having the right kind of food. So micronutrients are a problem. Farm incomes are very insecure. Farmers are leaving the land. That is global. In this country, it's true. The average age of a farmer in Britain is about 56. But globally, people are leaving the land because they can't make a living out of growing food. Land use, we all know what's happening to land in regions such as the Amazon, where it's being converted from rainforest to agriculture. So that's a massive problem in itself. Farm chemicals contribute to climate change, and all of these are interlinked. We can't look at one without looking at the others because they all feed off one another. We are looking at technological solutions for all of them, but let's be clear, technology will only get you so far. It is not going to be a panacea for any of these problems. We need policy and social change to go along with the technology. There will not be a silver bullet that can cure all the ills that we have out of food production and land use change, which, depending on which estimates you choose, go from about 10% from food production alone. If you include land use change for agriculture, you're talking about something between 20 and 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions are related to the food that we produce. So I'm going to go through some of the things that we're looking at on that slide. Just very quickly about who Rothamsted is. John told me he's never heard of us until recently, which I can't say the same about Oxfam. I guess you all know who they are. So we were founded in 1843. John Bennett Laws was a fertilizer magnate. He basically discovered that if you added bones to acid, you got a phosphate fertilizer, then used mineral phosphate, created the first artificial fertilizers, but they didn't know why plants responded to certain chemicals. So he got into bed with a chemist, Sir Henry Gilbert, and they started the first experiments to work out what it was exactly that gave plants the nutrition that they needed. And they started the experiments, which are still going at Rothamsted now, and have given us this very long time series showing how it is that plants make use of minerals and how that we can manipulate the chemicals that plants get in order to make them grow better. So originally, it was really about the NPK, the nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium, which we know are essential for plants. But we've come a long way from just looking at what chemicals plants need and dumping them on the land to see if they grow better, to looking much more at living systems. And we're going to have to make that transition if we're going to deal with climate change. So Rothamsted has been part of that journey. After the war, the focus was on delivering yield, getting food onto the tables and into the shops, because during the war, of course, Britain was nearly starved into submission. So there was a national imperative to grow more food, at the cost, it has to be said, of a lot of environmental damage. We're now trying to reverse that, looking at ways that we can deliver food more sustainably. That is going to be a massive challenge. And just to point out who, in terms of numbers, were basically funded by the government, about 30 million a year, and about 300 scientific papers a year. So that's more or less a scientific paper published by us every single day. And the amount of research that's going on across all our sites is really enormous, but that's because agricultural systems are complex and there are trade-offs to be made. And it's not as simple as introducing one sustainable practice here and expecting things to be okay over there. Everything is interlinked, and we're going to have to look very, very carefully at the system as a whole. Some of you may be familiar with, you can't see this slide, I'm afraid, because it's too small. Some of you may be familiar with the planetary boundaries concept. This is from the Stockholm Environment Institute from about 2009. The safe operating space for Earth. We know basically more or less the areas in which we can operate safely on Earth. And as you can see, in a number of areas, we are already massively over the safe space that we need to be in. Novel entities, things like pollution, plastics, heavy metals going into the environment, phosphorus and nitrogen way over. And these are largely agricultural. Land system change, again agricultural, way over. So agriculture is responsible for a lot of the damage that you're seeing there. Biodiversity as well, top left there, again, another agricultural problem. So we need to do something about that. We need to do it quickly. What can we do? We've got to reduce fertilizer use. Fertilizers are a big problem. We'll come on to that. There is a shift away from using fossil fuels such as tractors, for everything from solar-powered robots. That is happening, but it's very, very slow and very expensive at the moment. Can we sequester carbon as part of agriculture? Get carbon into the soil, get carbon into the crops, use farming as a means of sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. We've got to reduce our pesticide use. Why? Because we're destroying biodiversity, but also because producing pesticides also uses fossil fuels. So we've got to deal with that. And livestock, of course, the big, big issue. I'll come on to that in a minute. We also have to adapt. As the weather changes, our crops are going to change. We're already seeing that. What you're seeing, perhaps on the positive side, is we can grow grapes much better, so we get much better English wine because the climate is getting hotter. But also, that's going to change the makeup of crops in this country and globally. And in areas that are the hardest hit, such as the ones John's been referring to, it's going to mean a massive disruption, possibly not being able to grow anything at all. And that is going to be a major, major problem. New climate, new pests and diseases, we're going to have to guard against those. Diets will have to change. We can't carry on eating the way we do. I'll come on to that in a minute. And our farming systems need to change. People talk about regenerative farming. People talk about sustainable farming. What is that? It's being defined in all sorts of different ways at the moment, and no one is entirely clear. Where are the emissions coming from? This is probably the most important slide. Cattle, enteric fermentation, burping cows, burping sheep, nearly half of all the emissions coming from agriculture. Fertilizer, 17.4%, again massive. Down at the bottom, the fuels, tractors, combine harvesters, just 10%. So in fact, the main problems with agriculture are not to do with the amount of petrol and diesel that tractors are using. They're to do with the cattle, they're to do with manure, they're to do with fertilizers. So we need to look at those things that are creating the biggest problems and act accordingly. Why are fertilizers a problem? Well, first of all, making them takes a lot of energy. You've probably remember from school the Haber-Bosch process, developed in Germany just before the First World War, basically taking nitrogen from the atmosphere, putting it under enormous pressure and heat, and creating nitrate fertilizers. Takes an awful lot of natural gas at the moment, which is why we're seeing big problems with the war in Ukraine, and supplies of fertilizer and gas could affect the amount of fertilizer we have. But it's very energy intensive, so it emits carbon at that stage. We put it on the land, and we give off nitrous gases. These are very, very potent agents of climate change, and we need to make sure that they're not given off. So just putting that chemical on the land also contributes to the problem. Nitrate pollution, nitrate that's not taken up by plants ends up in our water courses, again creating problems. Nitrogen affects the soil microbiome. We all know about the microbiome in our guts. The one in the soil is just as important, and just as important for sustaining life on Earth. Too much nitrate, the bugs go wild. They start eating up the carbon, and the glue that holds the soil together starts to degrade. So nitrate supercharges the actions of the soil microbiome, degrades the soil, and contributes even more to climate change. And we also need to worry about phosphate. So phosphate, again, is something a lot of plants need, depends on where you're farming. Mining and processing that phosphate also contributes to climate change. And again, too much phosphate on the land, you've got pollution problems. We are looking at different ways of using phosphate. We need to recycle phosphate. It's a limited resource. Looking at things like sewage, looking at things like other forms of waste, getting that back onto the land. Can we do that safely? Again, that would be a way of reducing our dependence on mined phosphate, which comes from a number of areas that are actually quite politically unstable, Western Sahara, parts of Russia, parts of China. We cannot be guaranteed that these supplies will continue, so we need to look at recycling. But we do need fertilizer. Why do we need fertilizer? This is just one example shows how our production of food has managed to go up because of fertilizer as the use of land is going down. If you don't have fertilizer, you're going to need more land to produce the same amount of food. So we're going to need fertilizer of some kind. Whether that's going to be chemical or not, we don't know. But fertilizer has delivered. It has delivered the amount of food that the world needs. Now, that is not distributed equitably, of course. People go hungry, but that is not because there's not enough food in the world. Fertilizer has enabled the green revolution, but it's now creating problems all of its own. What can we do? Precision farming. Basically, we put far too much nitrate on the land. But if we know exactly what we need and where we need it, we can now map a field down to the square meter. We can look at the parts of the field. Every farmer will tell you parts of my field grow really, really well, other parts not so well. We can now map that right down, use that information, feed it into a fertilizer robot that can know exactly where to apply fertilizer over the field, massively reducing the amount of nitrate that you're putting on the land. It's using data effectively to be much smarter about how we target fertilizers. We need to monitor the soil. We can do that in real time. Every farm in the future will probably have monitors all around the farm, looking at moisture, looking at soil carbon, looking at the amount of nitrate. So the farmer will have a dashboard every morning and can look at that and work out exactly what to do so nothing is wasted, and the amount of runoff and the amount of carbon, the amount of nitrous oxide emission is limited. We need to look at nitrogen use efficiency. That's how the plants uptake the nitrogen. At the moment, it's about 50% of the nitrogen you put on a plant, only 50% is used. We need to up that. There are ways of doing it. But we are looking obviously on the genetic side. Can we get new varieties through using clever techniques with gene editing, for instance, that will enable the plant to use nitrogen more effectively? And we're looking at biostimulants. I've got two of our spin-out companies here. Sugar Ox, the top one, is making a biostimulant. Essentially, it makes the plant work better. It injects the equivalent of blood sugar into the plant. It's a spray. You just spray it on, and that makes the plant much more effective at uptake of nutrients. Again, so you need less to deliver the same amount of yield. And we're also looking at, the second one there, which is Glya, which is the picture in the foreground. What they are doing is looking at what they call them sugar dots. This is a nanotechnology that makes the plant photosynthesize better. Why? Because photosynthesis is really inefficient. About 95% of the light that lands on a plant is not converted to sugars. We got to up that so that plants can grow much more effectively and we can deliver more yield for less land. And the way we can do that is really to probe deeply into the biochemistry of plants and work out how we can tweak those biochemical pathways to deliver more with less fertilizer and less inputs as a whole. So precision agriculture, which I mentioned. The amount of data that we have now is enormous. Everything from satellite imagery to go right down to field level can be displayed on mobile phones, using robotics, using drones. Every tractor now has a computer on board so that we can feed in what is needed and where, and we can reduce our inputs. This also works in the global context. We can now get information to farmers on their mobile phones. A lot of farmers in lower income countries can now access that information. Can we roll that out? In some countries it's starting. How effective that can be, we don't know. But basically the data is there. We just need to make it available to farmers, and we need to put it in a form that they can understand and actually make practical use of. But the precision nature of farming is what's coming, so that we can be really, really precise about how we target the inputs for farming and reduce the climate impact. So, cows. I told you they are the elephant in the room, a cow in the room, and because they birth methane. As you know, cows eat grass, they've got 4 stomachs. It is the bacteria in the cow's stomachs that ferment that in order for them to get nutrients out of it. That produces methane in huge quantities. There are more cows than almost any other animal on the planet, apart from, say, chickens. And so the consumption of meat and dairy is a real problem. In fact, the National Food Strategy that Henry Dimbleby released earlier this year was calling for a reduction of 30% of meat and dairy in our diets. A lot of people will tell you that is nowhere near enough. So we're going to have to get used to eating a lot less meat and dairy if we really want to tackle this problem seriously. They are a major contributor to climate change. This is a cow having its burps measured. This device here has got a little tube going to the nose. We are looking at every aspect of livestock farming, see if we can drive down that climate impact. That is looking at the grass, it's looking at the diet, it's looking at the breed of animal, it's looking at the bugs in the stomach, it's looking at the way the land is used. A lot of people will claim, for instance, that cattle on land can put more carbon into the soil. It's true up to a point, but will it actually deliver more carbon sequestration given the cost of having the cow in the first place? We don't know. We're looking at every aspect of the system to see how we can tweak it to make it more climate friendly. And we're doing this at a farm down in Devon. And it also depends how you measure what it is you're getting out of the cow at the end. So can beef be climate friendly? In theory, if you're looking at bioavailable protein, in some circumstances it can be reasonably good comparative to other forms of meat. It depends what you measure and how you measure it, of course, and we're trying to look at different ways of accounting for carbon in those systems. We're looking at silver pasture, converting. You're used to seeing cows in green fields, but why can't they be in forests? So silver pasture was in fact the old way of grazing, very common before the enclosures, that cows would roam through forests. And you still see that in some places like Neck, which has been rewilded, famous estate in the south of England. We're doing it in Devon. We're looking at if we introduce trees, what are the costs of that? What are the benefits of that? Does it sequester carbon on the scale that we need? And we are looking at, if I can get this to work, the way the animals behave. So this is looking at the way animals graze. Any farmer will tell you, any farmer with cows, that they do not graze in a uniform manner. They stick in one corner of the field and they just graze there. So in fact, we're not using the land very effectively. These are our tagged cows in one of our fields. As you can see, they all hang out in the same place. That's where the best grass is. What we need to do is look at things like mob grazing, whereby we find virtual fences, and these are done essentially using new technology to kind of pen the cows in to move them around the field, so you make the maximum use of the land. Again, you're putting carbon into the soil all over the field rather than in one corner. But we need to look at the behavior of the animals, and also we need to have at the top of our minds animal welfare as well. So we want cows to be outside, we want them to be as natural as possible. We need to make a better use of the land. What these outlying cows are doing in the middle of the field, standing by themselves, I have no idea. We haven't asked them. But the way we graze cows at the moment is very inefficient, and it doesn't make the best use of the pasture that we have. Grass-fed as opposed to feedlot, we know is better compared to the American feedlot system. We need to look at the way animals behave as well. We looked at Willow at Rothamsted. Why Willow? Well, basically because it was regarded as a national resource after the First World War. We nearly ran out of baskets, would you believe? So a national willow collection was founded. And it's been at Rothamsted since for the last 20 or 30 years or so. Why is it of use? Well, we think it's a potential use for biomass. It'll grow almost anywhere, so you don't have to sacrifice food growing land to grow willow. You can stick it along bits of the farm where nothing else will grow. It's very good at sequestering carbon. You get this massive roots. This is willow after 3 years of growth. As you can see, it's enormous. So you're sequestering carbon. You can then use that as a biomass fuel. there's a lot of debate as to whether biomass fuels are actually any good in terms of climate change. You know, you plant corn in a field that could be used for food, you turn it into diesel. Have you actually really made any difference to climate change? The figures are not terribly convincing. With Willow, you've got this root system, it comes back every year, you harvest it every 3 years, you actually are sequestering carbon and producing a biomass fuel as well. In addition to that, you get the biodiversity, and it has chemicals in it that we think the farmers can make use of. We need to get over our use of pesticides, so that's better surveillance, also looking at better biological control. Can we bring bugs and insects into fields so we don't have to use pesticides? Doing a lot of work on wildflower strips at the moment, right the way through fields. So you have a kind of deck chair effect of wildflowers through the fields to try and bring the bugs we want into the field to tackle the pests that we don't want. And we have to look at the resistance of plants. I'm going to skip through these because I've been told to hurry up. I'm not going to get into GMO. I know that's something we're well known for. We do think GM crops have a lot of potential to actually, again, reduce inputs and increase yield using the clever techniques of GM. And then more novel, perhaps, is the new CRISPR technique, which is gene editing, like the cut and paste tool on a Word document. Again, that will turn chemicals on and off, will enable us to reduce inputs and boost yields. I'm going to just go over the fish oils example, and I'll skip over soils because we've mentioned that. What's going to make the big changes? We think if we can use gene technology well, we can get what's called C4, which is an improved photosynthesis, and more leguminous plants. You probably all know that clovers and beans get their own nitrogen from the air and fix it with the bacteria in their roots. What if we can get other crops to do that? What if we can get wheat to do that? What if we can get maize to do that? It's looking possible. There's a team at MIT who are getting quite close to doing this in wheat. If we can do that, think of the fertilizer we're going to save. So that's going to be important. Perennial crops. At the moment, we plant, we harvest, we plant again. What if we grow all the time? That's going to help preserve our soils. We've got perennial rice being trialed in China. We've got perennial wheat being trialed in America. We could have crops that just go on and on. At the moment, the yields are too low. There's no reason why we can't improve those varieties. Alternatives to meat, we're going to need them, but it's not what we do at Rothamsted, but you're probably aware of the lab-grown meat and fermented meat. Tree planting is going to be important, so willows again. Precision farming is going to be important. Vertical farming, which you've probably seen pictures of, very important, will be important in towns, but not something that we can really use for something like potatoes or wheat because the scale isn't big enough, but useful perhaps for salad greens in cities. And robotics are going to come important. Robotics are part of precision farming, but also, of course, they don't compact the soil, they're much lighter, they can be solar powered, and you're seeing them increasingly coming onto farms. So can the UK do it? The answer is possibly. We will need dietary changes, there's no doubt about that. We need the policy incentives. None of these things I've talked about are going to be taken up by farmers unless the financial incentives are there to do it. You've only got 40 harvests in your career as a farmer. You do not like to take risks and do enormous experiments with what you're growing. You need some certainty. So the policy incentives need to be there. We need to measure and monitor. We're talking now about paying farmers for public goods, but what are we paying for? You can't measure the amount of soil carbon. You can't measure the amount of carbon that's being sequestered by a particular farm. How can we pay for it? So that part of the puzzle has to be sorted out. And we're going to need technology and innovation. As I said at the beginning, that will not solve the problem. This has to be a major change across all society, and farmers can be a part of that. But I think we all need to think about how we can play our role in terms of reducing the climate impact of food production. Thanks very much.
Right, ready to go with questions. Are we a bit tight for time, or could we run into the tea break a bit? Yeah, I mean, we could use a bit of the tea break if necessary, perhaps, could we? Okay, anyway, first question, please. I think this is a question directed for John. James, sorry.
Yeah, so in terms of.
Well, shall I just repeat the question briefly, which is basically, can we use sewage to help to fertilise our soils organically?
It is already used to a degree, but obviously there are public health issues around using sewage. Actually, in a developing world context, it's even more important because the vast majority of human waste in the developing world is not connected to a sewage system. Most people have septic tanks. Those are pumped out, put into huge tankers, and then just discharged into whatever watercourse they can use. So in fact, there's a valuable resource there. It's full of phosphate, which we really, really need. There's a lot of work being done at the moment in can we actually convert that sewage into safe, usable products. I've seen it bagged up as dried phosphate fertilizer in Ghana. So there's ways of doing it. At the moment, I mean, people are pretty odd about their food. Consumers are pretty odd about their food, about what they consider to be natural, and how they might feel about knowing that sewage is part of what's helping their food to grow. There's an issue around consumer acceptance. Sewage is used, but at the moment, sewage is often contaminated by so many other things, heavy metals being a particular problem. The potential is there, but as you're probably aware, we haven't invested nearly enough in our sewage systems. That's why so much is going into the rivers just now. We need to operate on a massive scale to get that to work. In terms of the dead zones, you're absolutely right. I mean, you've got these huge nitrogen outflows at river estuaries right the way around the world, kills off just about everything. It's a huge, huge issue. And again, it's about too much fertilizer in the wrong place at the wrong time being washed into the watercourses. We need plants we need the varieties of plants that can deal with that, and we need the precision farming. And again, this is, it's all very well for me to talk about precision farming in a UK context. That's doable. But can we do that? Can we deliver that for farmers with far fewer resources? Can we give them, often you find in developing countries, for instance, fertilizer and pesticides are subsidized to encourage farmers to use more of it. When in fact, what they need to do is use it in a much smarter fashion. And it's getting those messages out and trying to give people, they get to a point where putting on more nitrate won't help, but they do it anyway because they've got it more or less free from the government. So there are perverse incentives in the system which need to be dealt with. All of those points are valid. And again, it comes down to social political action as much as it comes down to technology. The technology can make the sewage safe and applicable, but we need other policy actions in order to make it commercially viable. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you want to speak to that? John?
Just to say very quickly, within the development context, there is a sanitation methodology called CELCS, which is community-led total sanitation. It uses human waste to create fertilizer. I think it depends on a lot of things being right, like no artificial fertilizers in the community as well. But I honestly, I don't know the science. I've just, I worked in Sierra Leone and I saw it being implemented. So there are things being tried to make good use of human waste.
Next question
from me. Is there a least developed country where we can learn something with the way they farm and not as intensive as most
Always.
So
I think,
I'll just give the question to the Zoom people. The question is, what can we learn from developing countries, the least developed countries, about sustainable agriculture? Is that
Well, I think there's always things you can learn, and there are always practices going on that, I mean, we're finding more and more ways that the farmers have adapted themselves. But I think this whole emphasis on soil, coming back to the UK, came from India. It came from a colonial thing, of course, but I come from the guy there who's the original. I beg your pardon. Sorry, and other people. I can't remember the details off the top of my head, but the original philosophies behind things like soil association came from people who, a particular individual whose name escapes me, who was working in the colonial service in India and brought back ideas about using natural manures back to the UK and founded, what we would now see as the organic movement. So there has been a lot of cross information. And of course, the use of night soil, as it's called in China for fertilizer, has a long-standing history. So yes, there's a lot you can learn from what's going on globally. But there are tensions there, of course, about who owns those technologies and who benefits from those technologies and approaches. And I think that's sort of thing, again, that Oxfam will be very much involved with. Any more questions?
Just to say that Rothamsted contributed a lot in the past to some of these questions, from very work on the mechanical cow, beef protein, but somehow these things didn't really get taken up very much. And Harpenden on the problem of freshwater resources, which were a worldwide problem, and into the 1960s and 70s. Other scientists trying to get funds for biological control to reduce the use of chemical insecticides. For example, they had to get funding from the companies that produce these insecticides. So there is this conflict between the needs of the planet and the current commercial interests. So the interest is very much to see what Rothamsted is doing at the moment. Thank you. On the other side, first of all, on Oxfam, I wanted to present that managing to campaign to reverse the government's cuts to overseas aid.
Right. So I think the question is about how to use the research from Rothamsted when there are conflicting interests involved, whether that's something you can speak to. And then secondly, about aid, the aid budget and how that's used. So, yeah.
So you're referring to the cut from 0.7% of GDP to 0.5 implemented quite recently. So that's obviously an issue which we were very strongly opposed to, that cut being made. We are campaigning strongly through the avenues that we have with government and other influencers to reverse it. But you may have noticed that we have quite a resistant government at the moment who have said they will restore the 0.7 when the economic conditions prevail. But apart from keeping on asking, it's unclear when that will happen. Also important that because it was a percentage, even 0.7 of the reducing GDP was a cut to begin with, and then there was a cut upon a cut, which was doubly unjust for the beneficiaries of that finance.
Well, in terms of balancing commercial interests, it comes down to the policy framework. We pour public money into farming. It's up. We need to choose what that public money is for. About a fifth, they reckon, if public subsidy was withdrawn, about a fifth of all British farms would go under immediately. So public money is being poured into farming. We need to We need the policies that will drive exactly the change. You know, you know yourself that we've had beetle banks back in the 90s. You know, there's a long history of looking at biological control and, you know, bringing in bugs to eat pests or pollinators. What we're trying to do at the moment is be far more rigorous about it in terms of the measurement and trying to work out the economic costs. So with wildflower strips running through the reason we put them through the center of fields, of course, is if you put them around the outside, the bugs only get about a couple of meters in. So you're not benefiting the whole field. If you put it as a deck chair with stripes all the way through, there's like insect superhighways that can go in. But how much land should you give up to the wildflowers and how much benefit are you going to get? We don't know. So we're trying to work that out. The answer is it takes time. It takes about 3 years of using them to see any kind of benefit. It doesn't work for all crops and it doesn't work for all situations. But the evidence is coming in that it does work. But we just need to be much more systematic about it. And we've got a whole team working on the agroecology side right now. And hopefully some results will be feeding into the public sphere very, very soon.
Thank you. Derek?
Yes, I have two questions. My understanding on a worldwide basis, something like 30% food production is waste. When Tesco started investing in Poland, big farms in Poland, the problem is about there wasn't enough refrigerated warehouses to cope with all the food being produced. And you didn't mention that wastage. Obviously, wastage in Britain is different. We've got so much on our plates. Wastage in other countries. Second question relates to your use of Willow biofuel. As I understand it, if you have to move that Willow more than about 10 miles, the economic cost of transport outweighs the benefit of growing the fuel. That means we need a power station in Harpenden. I wonder whether that will take.
So I think the question is, the last bit is Willow really sustainable? And the first question was about food wastage, you know, and what can we do about wastage?
So food waste, you're quite right, 30%, more or less a third in the developing world context, that is in the fields and in transport to market before it actually gets to the shops. In the UK, it's from your fridge. Basically, people throw away about 30% of the food that they actually buy. I didn't go into that because it's a social problem. We need to think about how we incentivize people to waste less food. And yes, that would be an important aspect in terms of reducing the climate impact of food production, if we could be less wasteful with food. There's an issue around packaging in there as well, but I'm not going to go into that. What was the other question? Willow. Yes, Willow is not really great for everything. The way we see it working is, let's say you had a facility, a campus university that had a boiler, could put Willow all the way around the campus, chip that Willow, get it in the boiler, all on one site, will be entirely carbon neutral. Will it work for the country as a whole? No, it won't. We need a complete mix of renewables. We need solar, we need wind, biomass. Only under certain circumstances will biomass be either economically viable, as you suggest, or will actually contribute to being carbon neutral. So no, it's not an answer. It's only an answer in particular situations, and that's what we're looking at the economics of. How much land would you need, say, at a campus university for that to work? My colleagues are doing the sums on that. But I agree with you entirely. It's not going to be an answer for Harpenden, unless, of course, you put willows up and down the high street and absolutely everywhere else. So that's not going to happen. But it can be useful in certain circumstances.
Thank you. I'm going to take the liberty of asking the last question, which I hope will be relevant to both of our speakers, which is a lot of our food is produced in developing countries. And I'm going to ask the question, would it be better for them and better for the climate if they just produced food for their own consumption and we stopped drinking tea and coffee, maybe?
Oh, gosh. So that's $1 million question. I don't think there's a straight answer. It depends on circumstances, I would say if you like rice, buy your rice from India rather than from the USA, because you are maybe supporting farmers in India. I've also been in many places, I'm trying to think of an example, yeah, in Senegal during the mango harvest, driving from Dakar to Saint Louis along the side of the road. There are hundreds of vendors, each with a mountain of mangoes. And those mangoes are going to rot within 2 or 3 days if they're not sold. And they are not sold. You know, they just, you were talking about the food wasting in the field. It also wastes at that point of distribution and sale. So I just wished I'd had a juicing factory and could have brought some mango juice up to Harpenden that you could buy in the shops. Fair trade, of course. So there's no easy answer to that question. I think food sovereignty has been very controversial because like India has just embargoed exports of wheat because of the current sort of global crisis, and that is landing in different ways in different parts of the world. So there is no easy answer. I wouldn't like to say as a hard and fast rule that we should have a totally open food system or a totally national and closed food system. Neither is politically practical anyway. And one thing just to finish, and I'm winging it here a little bit, is I think, and James will know better, global food trade is basically run by 4 companies, the cargoes, etc. And we have 4 main crops in the world, which are wheat, maize, soybeans, and rice. And each one of those 4 crops is just grown in 4 countries who are all big exporters, like we've heard about Ukraine and wheat recently. So a system like that, so concentrated, is basically, it's unsustainable, isn't it? Maybe you've got something to say about it, but yeah.
No, I think that covers it, to be honest. No, I think food production is all about trade-offs.
Yeah.
And unsustainable, but what we're finding now is also lacks resilience. You get a shock to the system, the system can't cope, and we're seeing that right now with the situation in Ukraine. So yes, there are no easy trade-offs in food production. Food production always comes at a cost. The question is, can we balance those costs? And can we limit the impact in terms of sustainability, and can we keep the world properly nourished in an equitable way and maintain the environment that we need? There's never an easy solution to that, but we have to get what we need is what we're having now, which is a proper debate about what the costs and benefits are of particular systems and trading systems, and how that we can best guarantee fairness and sustainability across all of the different scenarios that we have.
Right, well, thank you very much, James and John. Perhaps you'd like to show your appreciation. Right, so we've got a tea break. I mean, do you want to say back at 3:30? Yep. Okay, back at 3:30, Prince. Thank you very much. I think it's about which direction should we move. It's not all or nothing, is it? Developing reviews should be moving in the direction of feeding themselves.
So there was a number of US films. So the companies like and then they figured out that if they didn't export so there was no answer to it. I think we have a diversity. Yeah, sort of a level of detail that
It always seems, I think it does happen Now, when there is starvation, where does the food?
I mean, I do. Yes, I mean, I